So it's important to understand that for now, though, the communists are not the popular, powerful force in China. The rising force in China, the one that's going to bring about this initial reunification, are in fact the nationalists. Now, remember, it is a little bit confusing because we have the two nationalists meanings in a sense, right? Nationalist with a capital N means a political party. Nationalist with a lowercase n just means someone who believes that the primary loyalty should be to the nation state, that the nation state should be strong and independent, and should certainly not be ruled by foreigners, and that all members of the nation should be united behind that nation state. So you can be a nationalist with a big N and a nationalist with a little n at the same time, but you could also be a communist who was a nationalist with a little n, meaning a communist who thought communism was the best way to make for a powerful Chinese nation state. For now, we're looking at nationalists, big N, little n, right? Same people. So members of the Nationalist Party, who are also nationalists, whose primary goal currently is to make China into a strong, unified nation state. And for now, they're going to be more popular. They're the ones who are going to build this initial reunification of China. Now, Sun Yat-sen, when we last talked about him, remember he's the leader of the Nationalist Party. He was elected first president of the Republic of China, but because of his weak position was forced to give that up to Yuan Shikai, who then basically destroyed everything by trying to make himself emperor and then dying. And Sun does not give up. He's going to continue to be active, and especially he's going to focus on building up the nationalist movement in southern China. That's the region he was originally from, particularly around the area of Guangdong, which is, as an aside, that's the area where most of the Western trading had gone on when China was first open to the West. Now, the problem that Sun Yat-sen faced is that a lot of liberal democracies, places like the United States, Great Britain, Japan, and France, did not support him. They were not particularly interested in having a strong, unified China. They didn't like Sun Yat-sen's nationalism because it promised, in a sense, to make a strong China. They much preferred a weak China that they could in a sense, obtain resources from, obtain cheap labor from, and they could keep their privileges. They didn't necessarily want a strong China. So what's interesting then is that even though Sun Yat-sen was not a communist, did not believe in communism, because the liberal democracies will not support him, he will look to the Soviet Union for support, and the Soviet Union will support him. Will say, yes, we will support you, and they will give advisors, they will give training, they will give money, and so forth. Now you may say to yourself, whoa, this is really weird. Why is it that the Soviet Union is supporting nationalists and communists at the same time, especially when they believe, the nationalists, that is, that they don't believe in communism, right? And I mentioned before, there's going to be a civil war. What's going on here? Well, one aspect of communist doctrine was the belief in a sense of what they called the double revolution. Basically, they thought that in order to have a successful revolution, or in this case, to complete the revolution of 1911, 1912, which many Chinese thought had not really been completed because it had only been a political revolution that destroyed an old government, it didn't set up a new government, that in order to successfully complete a revolution, the communists had to work with other forces. The communists on their own weren't strong enough. So the communists had to work with groups like any kind of non-communist nationalists in order to obtain a first revolution, which would clear out the old order and bring in a new order. Then once that was done, the communists could finally launch a communist revolution, right? So the communists believed there should be two revolutions. So the Soviet Union was willing to support Sun Yat-sen because he was a nationalist, he was a revolutionary, he wanted to completely remake China. And then once that was done, then the communists could take over and complete the communist revolution, right? That was the basic idea. Now, there's a certain kind of logic to it, but you'll notice the problem is what it means is working with someone knowing that later on you're going to try and overthrow them, right? This might make good sense strategically speaking, but morally it's problematic because you're like, okay, I will work with you nationalists, but we're going to overthrow you one day. So, and in exchange for this assistance from the Soviet Union, Sun Yat-sen allowed communists to join the Nationalist Party while maintaining their Communist Party identity, right? So this is kind of bizarre, right? This would be, in a sense, like becoming a member of the Democratic Party while maintaining your relationship in the Republican Party, right? They believe in different things, but that's the price. And the idea, that's the price for Soviet assistance. And the idea here right? The idea here is that the communists will form what's called a bloc within. They'll form like a group within the nationalists once China is unified. Again, once the revolution has reached a certain point, then they will take over later, right? Then they will take over later. So the communists are going to be part of the nationalists for now, with the understanding that they are going to take over later. And like I said, morally, this is kind of problematic. Doctrinally, from the communist perspective, remember, they believe in these stages of history. So I think you have to go through the stage of having this kind of liberal revolution, a Sun Yat-sen style revolution, and then later on you can have a communist revolution. Sun Yat-sen, at the same time, has become convinced that China is not yet ready for democracy. Remember, he was fundamentally a believer in liberal democracy. It was one of the three people's principles, was rule by the people. But now he was convinced, because of the failure of the Republic of China, because it had fallen apart, he now believed that a period of political tutelage, basically meaning a kind of benevolent dictatorship, was necessary before democracy, right? China was just not ready for a republic. The people needed to have serious reform undertaken. That's what the May 4th movement was all about. Once that, in a sense, was completed, once the Chinese people were ready, you would eventually have democracy. And Sun Yat-sen understood this as a kind of Western-style democracy with some socialist elements thrown in. Unfortunately for Sun Yat-sen, he will die in 1925. There's no foul play. There's no assassination attempt on him that kills him. He just dies of stomach cancer. It's this kind of curious thing that the Qing government had tried to kill him many times. Other people had wanted to kill him, but finally he dies of cancer. And leadership then will pass to a man named Chiang Kaishek. We will talk about Chiang Kaishek a lot, so very, very important person. But he was a nationalist, both in terms of membership in the Nationalist Party and a believer in nationalism. And he was head of the Nationalist Military Academy, right? He was head of the Nationalist Military Academy. So he was put in charge of helping to build up this army. Sun Yat-sen had learned that from the failure of the Republic of China, from the fact that Yuan Shikai was able to, in a sense, force him to give up his power as president, that if in order to unify China, you needed an army. So with Soviet help, he sought out to build an army. And the head of the Nationalist Military Academy that would help build that army was Chiang Kai-shek. And because he is in charge of the army, and armies are powerful, they're strong, he is going to be the one who will succeed Sun Yat-sen. So when you think of Chiang Kai-shek, think first and foremost of a soldier. Chiang Kai-shek is an interesting guy. He was not a particularly good speaker, for example. He never actually learned to speak Mandarin, the national language, very well. He spoke his local dialect and sometimes had to speak through a translator. He was almost shy when it came to public speaking. But he was also an incredibly disciplined and brave person. He was a very complex person because he was also incredibly ruthless. He had no problem killing people. He had done this personally. He had ties to gangsters. They had been key, in a sense, to his rise to power, especially in his early career. But again, he's this very complex person, because one thing that's very curious about him is he will marry, this is a little complicated, but there's this dynasty of Chinese, this family in China called the Sung family. The men in the family tended to be really good with finances, and they were the financial supporters of the nationalists, and nationalist leaders tended to marry their daughters. So Sun Yat-sen was married to a member of the Sung family, and Chiang Kai-shek also was married to a member of the Sung family. And the Sung family were all Christians, and they wanted Chiang Kai-shek to become a Christian since he was married into the family. And he agreed to study it. And he studied Christianity for a year, read the Bible several times, and eventually converted to Christianity. And in the last decade or so, his journals have been released, and it turns out he took Christianity very seriously. People at the time just said, oh, he's just doing this to gain support from Westerners and the Sung family and so forth. But he actually took it very seriously. In his journal, he would say things like, a Christian must be willing to endure suffering like Jesus, or he would say things like that, which show that he really took this faith seriously. So a complex guy, right? A guy who, like I said, is ruthless, disciplined, willing to work with gangsters, committed Christian, complex man. It's important also to stress that he was a staunch anti-communist. He had actually visited the Soviet Union, and what he saw there, he did not like. There was something kind of conservative about him. He did not want to destroy all that much of China. During the May 4th movement, all these people were like, we have to completely change and transform China. And Chiang Kai-shek was like, well, I want to build a strong and independent China, but I still want to maintain some of its traditional aspects. So, for example, he still liked Confucianism. He thought Confucianism needed to be reformed, but he didn't want to throw it out. And when you look at him, he's very much what I would call a Confucian Christian. Someone who believes certain things about Jesus, believes in God, but believes also that through prayer and through the study of the Bible and so forth, you could become a disciplined person and a good Confucian, right? And like I said, this guy's going to be very, very important, and especially he's going to be the one leading China when it has to fight Japan. But we're not quite there yet. Right now, we're working on how Chiang Kai-shek is going to help unify China. Right? It's been about a decade since it's fallen apart. He's going to be the one that starts to put it together. Now, if you ever go to China in May, be on the watch, because there's a good chance that something important is going to happen. It seems like stuff always happens in China in May, right? We just talked about the May 4th movement. We're now about to talk about the May 30th incident. Remember, the May 4th movement is sometimes understood to begin in 1915, because that's in a sense when this new journal, New Youth, is established. But also the May 4th date is actually from 1919, when you had these protests against the Versailles Treaty. And you may recall that I said this movement ends in 1925, right? This is often understood when it ends. Remember, the May 4th movement was primarily an intellectual movement that was trying to develop ideas that could be used to reform China, to make a new China. The May 30th incident marks the transition from thinking about how to make a new China to actually putting into practice the transformation of China in terms of building like real political institutions and social institutions and things like that. So what then is the May 30th incident? Basically, in the city of Shanghai, there were workers who were striking, Chinese workers. They were upset with how they were being treated in foreign companies. So you had foreign factories and other things that had been established in Shanghai, and they were upset with how they were being treated and launched a strike. And during the strike, foreign troops, right, so not Chinese soldiers, but foreign soldiers fired into a crowd of protesters, killing several. This was followed then by strikes and protests all throughout China. How is it that foreigners can come here, treat our people poorly in terms of giving them bad working conditions, and then when they protest against them, kill them? Right? Remember, these are foreign troops shooting Chinese protesters on what is essentially Chinese soil. Right? The foreigners have some privileges, but whether or not they have them, to Chinese people, this is still China. And you can see that on the right, this is a brochure, a kind of pamphlet explaining the Chinese perspective. And they're very good, right? They understand Western ways because they're doing this in English as well as Chinese. It says a direct violation of the principle of humanity, firing into these crowds. So there's this sense now, there's this growing protest that we have to do something, right? It's not just about developing and changing China. It's not about reforming old or even throwing out the old and building something completely new. We need to take this and actually take action. And this is the time to do it. And this is the inspiration to do it. And you can see on the left, and this is a poster that comes out of this time period, where there's this understanding that it's not just the foreigners that are beating up on us, right? On that picture on the left, you see a Chinese person and he's being strangled by two people. On the left is a foreign industrialist, right? A capitalist. And on the right is a warlord, right? Remember, China had fallen into bits and pieces. Most of the different bits and pieces were governed by generals who were basically military dictators. So basically the connection here is, look, China is weak. China is weak because we're divided by these warlords. We don't have a single effective central government. We're divided up in all these different areas by these warlords. And because we're weak, the foreigners can just come in here, treat us badly, and then shoot us when we try and protest. So we need to do something. we need to do something about this. And the something that the Chinese are going to do, or rather I should say Chiang Kaishek leading the nationalist army they've been building up, is to launch the Northern Expedition. Right? The purpose of the Northern Expedition, you can get a sense from this propaganda picture from the time period, is to use military force to unify China under the banner of the Nationalist Party. Right? We're going to unify China and form a single unified government under the Nationalist Party, using this army that we've been building up with Chiang Kai-shek as the leader. Now, this quote is from a book called The Wars for Asia, which I'm going to talk about more throughout this section. Very good book if you get the chance to read it. And this is a quote of Chiang Kai-shek that I found in this book, and I want to read it with you because it shows us what the Chinese understood themselves to be fighting for. This is Chiang Kai-shek giving a speech. The importance of this fight is not only that it will decide the fate of the warlords, but whether or not the Chinese nation and race can restore their freedom and independence hangs in the balance. In other words, it is a struggle between the nation and the warlords, between the revolution and the anti-revolutionaries, between the three people's principles and imperialism. All are to be decided now in this time of battle, so as to restore independence and freedom to our Chinese race. So you can see here some of these ideas that we talked about earlier. There's almost like a biological understanding of race here, but there's also this very strong nationalism, right? We want to be free from foreigners. We want to be strong. We want to be independent. We also want to be modern. And this is something that a lot of Chinese can get behind. They're tired of being weak. They're tired of being divided by these warlords. So many Chinese want unification. So Chiang's army will be welcomed by many Chinese. Many Chinese people will see his army as a revolutionary, liberating force that is going to build a strong China. This army will meet with a lot of success. They will trounce a lot of warlord armies. The warlords are basically, like I said, just military dictators. Their soldiers are motivated typically by an interest in profit, in just being able to be strong, whereas Chiang's forces are animated by the spirit of patriotism, nationalism, and a willingness to sacrifice and die if necessary to unify the country. Right? So you basically have a group of patriots fighting a group of mercenaries. The patriots are just going to fight harder than the mercenaries. And also, they've been trained very well. They've been indoctrinated in nationalist ideology, and they believe firmly in their cause. So they're going to trounce a bunch of the warlord armies and manage to unify a large chunk of China. Now, this is very complicated because I call this a kind of limited unification. First of all, just so we understand, this is called the Northern Expedition because it was a northern advance. Chiang Kai-shek and his forces were down there in the south, the most southern part of China. You can see by the arrows that they march north. That's why it's called the Northern Expedition. And you can see that they go pretty far up north into China. And they conquer a lot of the most important wealthy parts of China, places like Shanghai. They conquer the old city of Nanjing and make it their capital. That had been the capital during the Ming Dynasty. They're going to make it their capital during this dynasty, or during this period as well, I should say. You can kind of think about it as a dynasty if you like. So that's all great. And they're going to directly administer those areas. But you'll notice that there's large areas in the west and large areas in the north that those armies don't go, right? You can see the blue lines. There's large areas in the north and in the west that those armies do not go. So this is only a limited unification. What happens is those people in the north and the west, those warlords, they agreed to submit to Chiang and to become a part of his government without actually being defeated. Right? He doesn't actually conquer that territory. Those warlords agree to submit to Chiang and will agree to follow him, but they're not actually defeated, and they often get to keep their armies, and they often have positions of power still in those areas. So this is a problem. Chiang realized that it might be difficult to conquer all that territory with his army, which was not that big. And so he had to kind of accept this. And that's going to make his life very difficult because he's not going to, even though China is theoretically unified, the unity is limited. Because, like I said, there's these warlords in the north and the west who, even though they've accepted Chiang's rule and the nationalist rule in the Republic of China, they have not actually been defeated. They still have their armies. They still control a lot of that territory. And that will make Chiang's life difficult. But for now, we have to celebrate, in a sense, with the Chinese that after a decade of disunity, division, they finally have something like an effective central government. And this central government, for about the next decade, will become increasingly strong and put China on the road to becoming a powerful, independent country. So in China, we have a civil war going on. We can't forget that, right? We've had a civil war going on between the nationalists and their communist allies and the warlords. But towards the end of 1927, and the Northern Expedition is launched in 1926, but once we get into 1927, it's pretty clear that the nationalists are going to win, that they're going to be successful in at least achieving a kind of limited unification, and that's going to be good enough for their purposes. And so there becomes this issue of what to do about the communists. The communists had not been secret, or had not been particularly secretive, I should say, about what they planned to do. That is, that they planned, once the unification of China had been completed, once the revolution had gone far enough, that the communists would take over. This was pretty much common knowledge among people like Chiang Kaishek. They knew that the communists planned on taking over later and had actually been taking action to take over. Right? They hadn't been secretive about that. So Chiang Kai-shek decided, okay, we've achieved our limited unification. The communists might make a move. They're planning on making a move against us nationalists. They want to take over, so I'm going to beat them to the punch. This is what I mean about Chiang Kai-shek being ruthless. So what happens is, during the Northern Expedition, when the nationalists seize Shanghai, they are assisted in doing so by communists and by left-leaning labor unions and things like that, which are often friendly to the communists. And once Shanghai has been seized, Chiang Kai-shek decides, okay, now it's time to deal with the communist menace and with the menace of their allies, and he does this by killing several tens of thousands of people. And you can see there's lots of images like the ones you see there, but there you can see people like communists, leftists, union organizers, and things like that. They're being executed by nationalist agents, nationalist soldiers. Right? So remember, this alliance between the communists and the nationalists was just one of convenience. Neither one of them agreed with the other. They had very different visions of what a modern China should look like. They were only working with each other because they had the same goal of unifying China and getting rid of the warlords. That's been done well enough that Chiang Kai-shek doesn't think he needs the communists anymore. He doesn't want to give them the opportunity to strike against him, and they were planning to. So he decides to take action first. This is ruthless, but this is just how Chinese politics are working at this time, where there's a feeling we have to act now, we have to kill or be killed. And like I said, Chiang Kai-shek will have several tens of thousands of his enemies killed in these very visceral, violent ways. This also marks, though, a transformation of the Chinese Civil War. Remember, Chiang Kai-shek's speech, he was able to present himself as the force for revolution, the force for change and modernity and patriotism. And that was easy against the warlords because they didn't really have a plan for changing China. They just wanted to keep power. But those warlords are now no longer the same force they had once been. The major force now are the communists that could threaten Chiang, right? And they can also claim to have a vision of what a new China should look like. So the communists are a very serious threat to Chiang Kai-shek. He can't say they're not revolutionaries because they are. They have different ideas of what a new China should look like. So the Chinese Civil War, in a sense, will continue. There will continue to be fighting between nationalists and communists. The nationalists will be the dominant force throughout much of this time period. But the communists will exist as an armed insurgency. And so we won't have a civil war simply between warlords and patriotic Chinese. Well, we will have a civil war between Chinese who have very different understandings of what a new China should look like. Now, Chiang Kai-shek from 1927 to 1937 will face a lot of difficulties, but he won't face a full-scale Japanese invasion yet. That will begin in 1937. We need to kind of think about his situation if we're going to understand the rest of Chinese history. And I would argue that Chiang has multiple strengths, but that each strength is counterbalanced by a weakness. So, for example, he controls a big army, right? He controls a big army. However, that army includes many former warlord troops that were brought in as a whole, right? They just were integrated into the army in terms of just saying, okay, this warlord army is now part of our army, but it still maintained its cohesiveness. So that army could just break away if it wanted to and act against Chiang Kai-shek, and they did sometimes. And those troops are not necessarily loyal to Chiang Kai-shek. They're not particularly dedicated to the cause of the Nationalist Party. So on paper, Chiang Kai-shek has a huge army, but many of the soldiers are not particularly good, many are not loyal to him, and some will even rebel. Chiang also has some Western support. That's good, but that Western support is comparatively weak. For example, even though Chiang wants to make treaties that are equal, remember China had to face all these unequal treaties that gave foreigners rights in China. Foreigners don't want to give those up. And so Chiang Kai-shek, that's kind of an area of weakness for him, that he's not able to change these, right? If we're going to have a strong independent China, we shouldn't have to have these foreigners having all these benefits and privileges. He will have support from the urban middle and upper class and from landlords. That's his major base of support, right? If you're a middle class person, you're an upper class person, you're more likely to support Chiang Kai-shek. However, as we'll see, the class that's going to be key to bringing revolution and to winning the Civil War are not the urban middle classes or the upper classes or the landlords. It's going to be the peasants, and they will end up throwing in their lot with the communists, right? So Chiang Kai-shek does have strong support from certain sectors of society, but we'll later see that the communists mobilize the peasants, and they turn out to be the powerful people. Chiang has a strong claim to be the successor to Sun Yat-sen, right? He is recognized as Sun Yat-sen's successor, but others will claim also to be the successors of Sun Yat-sen. The communists in particular will make that claim as well. Chiang also has prestige from unification. He does manage to bring this limited unity to China to build an effective central government, not 100% effective, but one that is much more effective than what they had in the past. But he will lose this prestige quickly for two reasons. One is the increasing Japanese invasion, which will start in 1931, but really pick up steam in 1937. That's why we end in 1937. And a communist insurrection that he just can't deal with because of the Japanese invasion. And what will end up happening, and as we'll see, is he will be constantly criticized for focusing on the communists and not fighting the Japanese. We'll see later on that he had good reason for doing that. But for now, we have to emphasize that that hurts his prestige. And ultimately, he just can't deal with the fact of having to deal with an internal civil war, insurrection, while also trying to fight the Japanese at the same time. Right? It's a very difficult situation, and he's not going to be able to deal with it successfully.